Hello and welcome to this important event on the public humanities and the Democratic Commons. My name is Linda Martine Alcoff and I'm a professor of philosophy here at Hunter College. And together with my illustrious colleagues, Professor Nico Israel and Dr. Jonathan Fanton, I serve as one of the co-directors of our public humanities program, which is funded by the Mellon Foundation. The Public Humanities Program supports students to do publicly engaged humanities projects on topics of their own choosing. You can learn more about their projects on our website. We've organized this conference that begins today and continues over the next 2 Fridays in order to showcase the vital importance of the humanities to every current crisis in the United States as well as around the world. This conference will explore different dimensions of the challenges we face in strengthening our democratic public sphere. Our first event happening today addresses the overall question of what is the Democratic Commons. Next Friday, speakers will address questions in regard to the popular and social media. That will be on Friday, April 16th. And the final event on April 23rd will address the complicated controversies over monuments and public commemorations. I want to express our collective thanks to all of those who've made this event possible, all of our speakers, all of our moderators, also to President Jennifer Robb at Hunter College, to Roosevelt House and its director, Harold Holzer, to our program administrator, Arden Armbruster, and to our faculty planning committee who's been working for 6 months to organize this conference. So let me now turn this event over to my colleague, Sam Diorio, professor of French here at Hunter and a member of the Public Humanities Faculty Planning Committee. His own scholarship is on French cinema and French literature. And if you haven't read it yet, he has a wonderful essay on the Criterion Collection page about the scores of films and shorts that were made about May 1968 and the way that cinematic representations informed, challenged, and altered the democratic sphere. So please join me in welcoming Professor Diorio.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Linda. Thank you also to Nico, to Jonathan, to Arden Armbruster, and to Danny for doing the tech support today, and especially to my colleague Laz Lima, who put so much time, energy, and tireless devotion into organizing this event, as well as to our colleague Jessica Neuwirth, who I think is here, who was also instrumental to shaping and defining our panel today. I'm thrilled to be with you. Let's get started, I think, right away. Maybe we could ask the panelists to turn on their cameras. It's okay. Great. I'll be doing the introductions one by one as each speaker presents. There we go. So I think everyone's here now. We're really very fortunate to have Ranjana Khanna, Toure Reed, Dwight McBride, my colleague Laz Lima, and Wendy Brown with us to be talking about the Democratic Commons today. And I'll start out just by introducing our first speaker, who is Dr. Lazaro Lima, Professor of Latino Studies in the Department of Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latino Studies here at Hunter. His work centers on the political, juridical, educational, and cultural industries that enable Latino democratic legibility and participation to emerge in civil society. Dr. Lima's books include the 2019 study Being Brown, Sonia Sotomayor, and the Latino Question, Ambientes, New Queer Latino Writing, which is a collection of essays co-edited with Felice Picano, and The Latino Body, Crisis Identities in American Literary and Cultural Memory. He's also the executive producer and co-writer of documentary films, including most recently Carolyn Brown's Ruby, A DACA Dreamer in Trump's America. So please, Laz, over to you.
Thanks so much, Sam. And let me just reiterate how grateful I am to be participating with all of you and also the incredible work that Roosevelt House undertakes to make sure that we continue a public intellectual life that is visible despite the constraints of this moment that we're going through, and certainly this pandemic. So my appreciation to you as well, Sam, for leading the discussion that will ensue. I want to begin by just making some claims about basic understandings of the commons. So let me start there. And at its most basic, we can understand the commons as that space of messy self-governance in the town square, where citizens and citizens in the making come together to make demands of each other and of the state, of the government. And there's an implicit understanding, and I think this is important, that in the commons, we live with those we don't necessarily choose to live with, and to whom we may not feel any cultural, affective, or political affinity, yet we presuppose their own humanity, so that our own humanity in turn is not delimited or infringed upon. But in our political moment, we're seeing rather the shrinking of the democratic commons rather than its flourishing. So the democratic commons is simply something that we need to understand that's under assault in ways that were previously unimaginable. So let's think through some of these signal flashpoints that have happened in the recent past. From the January 6th insurrection to the denaturalization of citizens, we're really living through a moment of unparalleled anti-Black, anti-Brown, anti-Asian racism, ethno-nationalism, xenophobia, and more. In short, the promise of an egalitarian society is being delimited rather than fortified. Indeed, for thinkers like Jed Purdy or Kate Aronoff and many others, some are, of course, here in this panel, the question of the commons in our moment is a question of signal importance because it is fundamentally about asking ourselves who gets to live in the 21st century, how and under what conditions. So how do we get here is one of the topics that I hope we get to explore with some clarity in the Q&A session. But given the significance then of the task at hand, I think it's important to understand the various ways that the commons has been conceived and how those conceptions, those different versions of the commons, either open or delimit possibilities for more rather than less egalitarian and democratic life. And what I like to do is share with you just briefly, and certainly with broad brushstrokes, how we might go about understanding some of the competing frames for imagining the democratic commons and how they really emphasize different aspects of democratic practice or its shrinking. And these frames are, of course, not exhaustive, but they're points of departure for what I hope will be our conversation today. And in doing so, I'll simply refer to specific concepts and thinkers related to these frames for understanding the commons. And I do this specifically because, as Linda mentioned earlier, while we were convening and discussing how to proceed, many of our students, many of our interlocutors in various disciplines don't have an understanding of what we might mean by the democratic commons. So I'm going to be prosaic, but for the sake of bringing in students and other interlocutors into this conversation that might otherwise be excluded if we didn't have a base understanding of what the commons refers to. And I frankly just consider that a form of commons making that we do in the classroom that is bringing in an intergenerational connectedness to this notion of what freedom means, of what the commons means in relation to our participation in a democratic system. So I'm going to mention what I'm calling the four versions of the commons, and then I'm going to give specific examples of some representative issues within each that I find either illuminating or alarming. So to begin with, we could think of a vernacular democratic commons. So the description that opened up my discussion today was a reflection of what we might understand as the sense of participating in a democratic system in a way that allows us to know and understand that even though we may not get our way every time, through our representative officials, through the ways that we make demands on governments and on systems and institutions, that we believe that it is perfectible. The second that I will actually focus on in a little bit of detail is what I'm here calling the aspirational democratic commons. And thinkers as illuminating as Jed Purdy, for example, have been central to my rethinking the commons in terms of climate change and in terms of forms of participation that are ever shrinking. And something that I'm a little bit more familiar with that I won't discuss necessarily is what I called before the brown commons. And I'm thinking of thinkers such as Cristina Beltran and even Jose Esteban Munoz in the way that they inflect this concept of democratic practice with the ethnic particularisms of groups that have been heretofore denied some sort of representational space in institutional practice, be that the canon, if you do literature, be that institutions, be that law or what have you. And then I'm going to focus more specifically and with a little bit more detail on this fourth version of the democratic commons that I'm here calling somewhat ironically the post-democratic commons, or what others have called the neoliberal commons. Three of these four versions that I've just outlined for you purport a vision of the commons that understands democratic practice as the ability to share power premised on individual and collective freedoms. But in the case that I'm calling the post-democratic or neoliberal version, its goal is to delimit the ability of people's ability to share power through the force of law. So one example that I'm sure all of us are familiar with, and certainly that I've discussed recently with my students, is Georgia, and how Georgia is attempting to legally delimit people's access to representation through draconian voting rights restrictions. So that's something that is a point of entry for discussions in the classroom, and that is something that the majority of the population that's paying any attention to the news would understand. Now, let me give you an example of this push that I've described toward delimiting the rights of others that is certainly not as well known as the Georgia case. And I do this because I'm interested in understanding how what we represent in the public sphere, in media, in circuits of communication, sometimes leaves out so much that needs to be addressed in a way that might be meaningful for achieving a perfectible democratic practice. And I want to focus on the little known recent history of denaturalization. And I begin with just a simple definition that denaturalization refers to the processes through which citizens can be legally stripped of their citizenship and due process rights. And it emerged, not surprisingly, early on in the former administration's arsenal against brown people. So denaturalization is legal in that it can occur against an individual in either civil or criminal proceedings. And to prevail against a citizen, the government must either prove that the person in question was never statutorily eligible for citizenship in the first place, or that the person obtained their citizenship by concealing or omitting, wittingly or not, a material fact. And I'm thinking through these topics with writers such as Rafia Zakaria, who has really written extensively about this and how she's made these stakes involved explicit. And I'm going to quote something from her that I think is useful to situate some of the examples that I'm going to give about the delimiting of the democratic commons. And she writes, the previous administration's push to pursue denaturalization should be considered as one of the pieces of the jigsaw that is closing off the United States to non-white individuals, beginning with the Muslim ban upheld by the Supreme Court, extending to the vastly sped up ICE raids in areas with large Latino populations, to the detention and separation of asylum seeker and families at the border. These bits and pieces, she tells us, come together to reveal a worldview that accords with, she says, white nationalism. And two operations I think are significant to mention. And those are, the first is the It's called the Janus operation, which is based in Los Angeles. And for example, the last time I checked, it had created over 30,000 cases that have been reported for prosecution and that may result in denaturalization. So again, I want to stress this specifically to students. We're talking about stripping US citizens of their citizenship, people that have lived here all their lives, people that have been born here. The second that I think is useful, and I hope that students get a chance to research, is Operation Second Look, whose purpose is to review hundreds of thousands of petitions to locate just the teeniest of discrepancies in order, again, to denaturalize citizens. And in a curious aside, the US Immigration Customs Enforcement, ICE that is, which serves as the police arm of both of these operations, produced a handbook. And in that handbook, it was very clear that part of their imperative was to push for denaturalization. So not just seeking out undocumented individuals and processing them through the system, but rather to explicitly engage in activities that would somehow make certain individuals have to demand that they prove their relationship to the state by producing more information that one might have other than a passport or a birth certificate or what have you. Another instance that I think is telling and is a point of departure for understanding this restrictive development in understanding the Democratic Commons is the crackdown on what's been called midwife-issued birth certificates, which in itself is a common and born of historical tradition on the US-Mexico border, where you have lack of medical care along the border and therefore midwives assist. And for so long, we've proceeded in a way that allows us to just go to the town registry and make sure that the kid that was born 3 miles away is issued a birth certificate. Well, these are being taken away. And I'm looking at the chat just to make sure about the time. So Sam, please let me know.
Yeah, maybe you could, I think you got about a minute or a minute and a half, take a couple minutes to wrap it up. Sorry, this is super interesting, but we have to keep moving through the program.
Yeah, thanks. There's a lot I want to say, but I want to pause there with regard to the examples that I've given you about denaturalization processes. And I want to focus perhaps on a more optimistic note, what I'm calling the aspirational democratic commons. And again, I mentioned the work of Jed Purdy and several others. And we can conceive then of this aspirational democratic commons that it starts from the premise that we may not understand each other or even want to be with each other, but that we have to understand our capacity for being collaborators, helpers, and even friends. And if that sounds lofty, it's certainly a point of departure that's a sharp contrast to the type of version of the commons that I've just described with the anti-democratic push that we are seeing right now collectively. And that's why this aspirational democratic commons pivots towards an understanding of the commons that is political in nature, because it's about a collective we understood as collective agency, a political and cultural agency that can in turn reshape structures of power, economic orders, as well as infrastructures. In short, an aspirational commons that understands political membership as a moral and legal infrastructure. And I had a lot more to share with you, but I'm going to pause there to give the helm over to our colleagues. So please, Sam, go right ahead.
Laz, thank you so much. That's the great shortcoming of the great thing about a panel is that you get to have lots of different contributions. The great shortcoming is that it was so interesting, and hopefully we can come back to some of those ideas in the discussion. So maybe we could move to our next speaker, who is Dr. Rajana Khanna, professor of English, literature, and women's studies at Duke University, where she's also the director of the John Hope Franklin Institute. Dr. Khanna is a literary critic and theorist who's recognized for her interdisciplinary feminist and internationalist contributions to the fields of postcolonial studies, feminist theory, literature, and political philosophy. She's best known for her work on melancholy and psychoanalysis, but has also published extensively on the questions of postcolonial agency, film, Algeria, area studies, autobiography, Marxism, and visual and feminist theory. These are all areas which personally I'm very interested and invested in. So we're very excited to hear her today. Dr. Khanna is author of several books, including Algeria Cuts Women in Representation, 1830 to the Present from 2007, and 2003's Dark Continents, Psychoanalysis and Colonialism. Her theorization of subjectivity and sovereignty, including her recent work on disposability, indignity, and asylum, engages with the work of diverse thinkers, including Derrida, Irigaray, Kant, Marx, Heidegger, Beauvoir, and Spivak. So welcome, Dr. Khanna. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here and meet new friends and see old ones. And thanks very much for the invitation. So in thinking about the description of this event, how I might contribute to the conversation as someone who studies post-colonial and feminist literature and theory, my first response was to wonder what nation exactly we're discussing here. I assume it is the US that is being described with this idea of the increasingly multiracial and multi-ethnic terrain that we inhabit. As a whole, of course, the US is far less multiracial and multi-ethnic than many nation states around the world. And that, of course, raises the question of how we understand race, ethnicity, in that idea of the multi-ethnic, the multiracial. Usually diversity is assessed globally in terms of linguistic diversity, which makes countries in Africa the most diverse in the world. Other multilingual countries important, India, for example. I say this not only to point out that the US is actually not that diverse as a whole, even if various pockets and cities are diverse, though for the most part, with the exception of LA, not the most diverse cities in the world. The question arises also, however, of whether diversity is and of itself a problem for democracy or for an idea of the commons, or indeed for the concept of the political or concepts of the political. I'm not a specialist of the US at all, and therefore have only peripheral knowledge of the US nation's domestic history as someone who lives here and who thinks, as well as neither am I an expert of its foreign policy. But let me nonetheless come into this question of the democratic commons backwards, as it were, and what it means for these questions around diversity, also through this other route. To state the obvious, democracy emerges as a term in relation to the city-state, Athens. The commons in relation to the country, for the most part. Raymond Williams, though through his reading of English literature from the 17th century on, writes of the bucolic notion of rural life, a simple, natural, pure, Edenic, prelapsarian, in other words. And Williams describes this as, quote, a myth functioning as a memory that covers over class conflict, animosity, indeed enmity. He's describing the period of enclosure, of course, and within that, a structure of feeling, the various strands of thought evident in literature vying to emerge into dominance at any one moment in history. E.P. Thompson, who also drew on English poetry, but of course is primarily a historian, a Marxist historian, traced in his book Customs in Common, custom law and common right as a way of understanding, quote, a pool of diverse resources, end quote, containing conflict and contradiction. For example, shaming, he described shaming rituals like rough music that were usually used against those who transgressed moral and sexual boundaries. E.P. Thompson was more insistent and perhaps more sympathetic to these customs in common that characterized the commons, as it were, prior to, quote, enclosure, when all sophistications are allowed for, was a plain enough case of class robbery, he says. Now, when E.P. Thompson sought out the trace of a commons thinking, when he participated in and was an extremely important figure in the campaign for nuclear disarmament in Britain, he became interested in particular in the women's anti-nuclear movement at Greenham Common. And he drew inspiration too from the post-colonialist non-aligned movements who refused the dividing up of the world into the US and the USSR for the sake of nuclear proliferation. The commons, as those who stood, the commons in that idea, in those ideas, in fact, those who are part of the commons, as those who stood against such global division, was invoked. And today, in a sense, the idea of the commons has moved from that particular idea of a nuclear threat, that particular form of thinking that in literary terms was very much framed within an apocalyptic narrative, to that of the Anthropocene. And as Laz says, people like Jed Purdy have written about this. My colleague Saskia Corns, thinking about the literary prehistory of Anthropocene thinking through the study of the land and the country and the way in which it's represented. E.P. Thompson also drew from writers like C.L.R. James, who wrote of the poverty of party politics with a call for an attention to the voices of the people, right? And he did that from his very early work on Hegel all the way through. Raymond Williams was less romantic, I think, about the commons than E.P. Thompson, partly because he described how modernity happens throughout Britain, not just in its industrial cities. From a post-colonialist perspective, I think this was somewhat obvious. The other outliers to the cities beyond the country were, of course, the colonies, where land was divided up or occupied for the sake of the industrial sites of the cities. The city then became the site of modernity in that kind of thinking. The country and the colony were the elsewhere and presented largely as the backward, something that gets then transposed and transported into the colonial metropoles itself. You might think of, say, Fanon's description of Algiers at the beginning of The Wretched of the Earth, where the city is divided up in this way, and in fact, all the rebellion that was happening in the country in Algeria is largely ignored, in fact, as part of the struggle for independence. But I think that these questions of thinking about the country and the colony, as it were, and where the city is important in this regard, raises questions about what we understand as democracies through the structures of the city, right? The democracy itself as a city form is instrumental in the concealment of what modernity is and what divisions are, what those divisions mean for the suppression of difference and for the rejection of division. Pratima Banerjee has discussed recently in her recent book how in Europe, of course, we know modernity, and in many places, not only in Europe, modernity was associated with industrialization largely. But in a colony like India, she argues, it became associated with political form, with democracy as political form, in fact. So for her, and also for me now, the question becomes one of not so much, in fact, what might the democratic commons look like, but actually through thinking about the thorniness of those terms, commons and democracy, what constitutes the political? Without a romanticization of either the commons or of democracy. And I'm not saying that anyone here is romanticized at all. Clearly not, clearly not. But the terms themselves have a history of a certain romanticization. I want to end my comments, my brief comments here, with some words from a book that has been for a long time my sort of go-to book, Nicole Leroux's book, The Divided City, which is a book on ancient Athens, where she discusses the division that is part of the city by virtue of the fact, of course, that women and slaves are not citizens. And she says there, just think about that idea of democracy as city form in your head. The principal aim of an evocation of an idealized city is in fact forgetting. The narratives allows the erasure of everything that precedes it, especially the actual modalities of the political takeover. Whereas in other cities, so she's talking about other cities that don't become this democratic dominant city form, the demos forgets nothing of the harm done and proceeds to redistribute the land, a practice that ever since the archaic period has been a symbol of subversion. In Athens, the people have politikotata. That is, not only were the Democrats, in a sense, Aristotelian long before the term existed, because they ensured the continuity of the polis beyond misfortunes and changes of constitution, but also they defined politics as the practice of forgetting less their grievances than the very content of the word democratica, which presupposes an active presence of the people in their kratos, this active presence that the Homeric poems simply call memory. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. And again, we have a lot of, the discussion is going to be rich, I think, afterwards. So thank you again. Let's move on to our next speaker, our third speaker, Dr. Dwight McBride, who became the New School's 9th president in April 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, it sounds like, right? Prior to this, Dr. McBride was provost and executive vice president for academic affairs at Emory University, where he also held the position of Asa Griggs Candler Professor of African American Studies, distinguished affiliated professor of English, and associated faculty in women's, gender, and sexuality studies. Dr. McBride's publications, 2002's Impossible Witnesses, Truth, Abolitionism, and Slave Testimony, his 2005 collection, Why I Hate Abercrombie and Fitch, Essays on Race and Sexuality, and the Lambda Award-winning anthology Black Like Us, A Century of Lesbian, Gay, and Bisexual African-American Fiction, examine the connections between race theory, Black studies, and identity politics. He is co-founder and co-editor of the James Baldwin Review, co-editor of the New Black Studies book series at the University of Illinois Press, and is currently completing a new book on Phyllis Wheatley and her critics. So welcome, Dr. McBride.
Thank you so much, Sam. I appreciate it. And it's good to be here with all of these incredible and distinguished new colleagues and old friends as well. As a recently minted university president, having begun my tenure amidst, as you pointed out, dual pandemics, I offer a few thoughts on the relationship between universities and the Democratic Commons. Thoughts that are beset, of course, by worries that we all share about our fractured public and the way forward for our democracy, which we have all learned of late is more fragile than many of us suspected. I'll focus my remarks today on 3 fundamental statements, each having achieved the status of an oft-cited now truism, but each also with its own complicating past. One is that public confidence in the role of higher education is waning. Number 2, our fourth estate has collapsed under the paradigm shift of social media. And 3, despite unprecedented connectivity, we are more disconnected than ever. The confidence in higher education is today perilously in doubt. And as the Chronicle of Higher Education reported in early March, between 2013 and 2019, the percentage of adults who agreed that college was very important declined to 51% from 70%. There are, of course, many reasons for this dwindling confidence. Wave upon wave of conservative political attacks on the university sector in particular, and on the notion of expertise in general, that began to ripple in the 1970s with the advent of cable television and the marriage of the religious right and fiscal conservatives, which rose to a height during the so-called culture wars of the late 1980s and 1990s, and has recently crested with the political ascendancy of a bankrupt reality con man to the presidency. All are surely a part of this same pernicious parcel. Amid this furor, college education, in short, is no longer seen as a public good, readily demonstrating its, and these are used intentionally, value proposition or its return on investment. Now, part of this, no doubt, is due to the debt burden weighed against exponentially increasing American income inequality. Student loans have eclipsed credit card debt and auto loans and are now second only to mortgage debt. Now, despite the fact that the story of that legacy is more complicated than this, including that there has been a gargantuan decline over the past several decades in state support of higher education, placing more of the burdens on families in the form of tuition. The dismal waters of public opinion that faculty and administrators must wade in are awash with parents and students who see the cost of college rising, but the value of that investment constantly under merciless attack. Now, when institutions devoted to knowledge and history and a sector pursuing truth and reasonable debate are cast into doubt, it should little surprise any of us to see metaphorical assaults against expertise and democratic participation twisted into an actual attack on democracy, such as we witnessed earlier this January. That the coverage of that riotous insurrectionary coup attempt was more news analysis than news reportage should surprise us even less. Over and over, we're told how horrific it was, that having failed to make it 150 years ago, the banner of the Confederacy flew in the Capitol in 2021. Countless times we were informed that DC had only ever been stormed by troops from a foreign source during the War of 1812. That a domestic sect under the banner of Dixie could do such things, we were constantly advised by the pundits and the politicians, was unprecedented, outrageous, and perhaps most egregious of all, offensive. It is offense and outrage, after all, which capture that most precious of currency, and that is our attention. Never once were we informed that troops had indeed been stationed in DC ahead of a transition in presidential power during another period of intense partisanship and political brinksmanship. In 1861, facing fears over threats to assassinate then president-elect, then President Johnson ordered troops to DC to ensure a smooth transition of power as he handed over the reins to Abraham Lincoln. As Buchanan himself noted in a speech that would widely be reprinted in the newspapers, and I quote, "The peace and order of the city itself and the security of the inauguration of the president-elect were objects of such vast importance to the whole country that I could not hesitate to adopt precautionary defensive measures. Had I refused," he continues, "to adopt this precautionary measure, and evil consequences, which many good men at the time had apprehended had followed, I should never have forgiven myself," end quote. Examining this precedent, it seems, would have required a little too much explanation, too much history, too much context, none of which results in the unceasing indignation that sustains public attention. That a political operative as cravenly opportunistic as Senator Mitch McConnell or any of Trump's other mendacious minions could twist himself from condemnation to acquittal back to condemnation within a week demonstrated that we would lack even the short-term historical memory to hold him to account. As I mentioned at the outset, our fourth estate has collapsed. This is not per se an indictment upon every journalist or every media outlet. There are countless dedicated journalists among us still who strive mightily to report, unpack, and explain. My aim here instead is to point to the paradigm shift in all media wrought by the rise of social media technologies. When media outlets are optimized for attention, values and virtues like authority, expertise, and indeed truth are no longer a necessary part of the business model. In this new context, after all, where participants compete for attention, we argue, or is it fight, to win, to crush our political opponent, rather than participating in generative and generous argument or debate as a means of arriving at better understanding and potentially even, dare I say it, compromise on practical solutions. Unable to compete unless it is for attention, traditional journalism has collapsed as our public sphere has moved to private online platforms. And make no mistake, optimization for attention is the coin of our media realm. And so all media outlets must therefore compete for it. The putatively free modalities of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and their ilk were adopted under the premise of greater connectivity. But to riff off of James Baldwin's The Price of the Ticket, of James Baldwin for a moment, the price of that ticket that we are now learning is particularly a high one. And these private companies seeking private gains massively impact our public realms with little to no public accountability. The business optimization of these platforms has never had anything to do with something as lofty as a public good. The algorithms sorting users into further heterogeneous, discrete entities, foisting upon us feeds that rarely ever encounter difference, much less debate, have produced increasingly isolated, self-empowering echo chambers. This is not a bug, to use a computer science term. It is, in fact, a feature. So too are the ubiquitous methods for any manner of response, from comments to likes to pins to retweets, which in turn beget ever more responses, again, by deliberate design, not by accident. These features further the true inventory that drives the meteoric rise of these platforms, again, our attention. We provide the material on the feeds, the inventory that they do not pay for and profit from, inventory that we readily, freely give away in exchange for access. In his wildest dreams, Karl Marx could scarcely have concocted a more perfect exploitative system. The upshot of this shift, the price of our democratic commons, is that we have little incentive for democracy because we feel we have so very little in common. We may well be engaging, but what stands for engagement today is anything but civil. In the little time that I've left, I want to suggest a few stones that we will surely need to pave smoother roads ahead. And yes, we need to vote, for that is the system of accountability in any democracy. But accountability needs also to be laying at the feet of our social media platforms. Other countries have begun to grasp this necessity. As Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister, speaking after an attack coordinated via Twitter and Facebook resulted in the massacre of 51 Muslims in March of 2019, put it, and I quote, "We cannot simply sit back and accept that these platforms just exist and that what is said on them is not the responsibility of the place where they are published. They are the publisher, not just the postman. It cannot be a case of all profit and no responsibility." Or to take another example, as the president of Microsoft, Brad Smith, recently wrote with no small irony as head of a tech giant, and I quote, "It is unrealistic to expect the pace of technological change to slow, but it is not too much to ask that we do more than to manage this change. The 3 centuries since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution are devoid of any major industry successfully regulating everything about itself completely by itself. It would be naive to think the first successful case will emerge now," end quote. Our democratic commons has been given over to private companies driven only by private financial gain. All of us must demand that they be reformed with a public interest in mind. As university faculty and administrators, we cannot shirk our own responsibilities to also renew public commitments and to demonstrate anew our value. The foundations upon which we build a truly democratic society may sound simple, but today they are certainly far from self-evident. A vibrant university sector committed to the values of knowledge production, the search for truth, the vetting and verifying of information, unapologetic about facts, authority, and expertise is an undeniable ally to a functioning public sphere. To restore the public confidence, we must also work to decry and disprove the mischaracterizations of why we are here and what it is that we do here. For perhaps the most vehement and recent attacks on the university, an attack that has made strange bedfellows indeed across the political spectrum, is the mischaracterization of universities as hotbeds of radical liberals and places where anyone not sufficiently woke must be silenced. Bemoaning diversity training, refusing to encounter any history that isn't inherently triumphalist, mislabeling any sort of social justice accountability as cancel culture, and insisting upon the right to be callously indifferent to difference is, it seems, a cottage industry of late. I aim my parting remarks here to university students whose power within the university sector is more palpable than ever, and bid you to keep in mind the function of the university as a place of challenge and a place of growth. Challenge and growth are inherently difficult things, and in a university sphere, these challenges can and indeed should be generative and argumentative. To paraphrase Wesleyan University's president, Michael Roth, universities should strive to meet students where they are, but it would be malpractice to leave them in the same place that we found them. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much for those remarks. Our next speaker is Dr. Toure F. Reed. He's professor of 20th century US and African American history at Illinois State University. He earned his BA in American Studies from Hampshire College and his MA and PhD in history from Columbia University. Dr. Reed's research focuses on the impact of race and class ideologies on African American civil rights politics and US public policy from the progressive era through the presidency of Barack Obama. He's published in Catalyst, the Journal of American Ethnic History, Labor, Nonsite.org, Black Agenda Report, Jacobin, The Nation, and the New Republic, and is the author of 2008's Not Alms, But Opportunity, The Urban League and the Policy of Racial Uplift and the Politics of Racial Uplift, 1910 to 1950. And his most recent book is 2020's Toward Freedom, The Case Against Race Reductionism. Welcome, Dr. Reed. We can't hear you, sorry.
I realized I'm muted. Thank you, it's an honor to be here today. I want to talk to you about what I see as the limitations of the dominant identity-centered discourse on racial justice, because I think this discourse often undercuts the collective we that was at the heart of Dr. Lima's great discussion on the Democratic Commons. I think this discourse undercuts the collective we because, one, the dominant racialist frameworks obscure the capitalist processes that both generate many of the inequalities and contribute to some of the malignant attitudes we have seen before us quite recently. And two, these constructs promote counter-solidaristic perspectives owed in no small part to their frequently reifying race, which likewise undercuts the commons as a space for shared governance. While the problem I point to, which comes down to a longstanding tendency to divorce race from class and post-war liberalism, dates back again, a number of decades. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to set the Wayback Machine's dial to just about 13 years ago and move forward from there. In 2008, I was one of those rare Black Americans who was not excited about the prospects of a Barack Obama presidency. I should confess that in 2008, I was so certain that visceral prejudices alone would foreclose the presidential ambitions of a Black man, even one whose middle name was not Hussein, that I placed a bet against Obama with a white liberal friend. While I made this wager shortly after Obama secured the Democratic presidential nomination, I would likely have made that same bet even after the emergence of Sarah Palin and the collapse of Lehman Brothers. Obviously, my instincts were wrong. In fact, in 2008, Obama captured a larger share of the so-called white vote than Bill Clinton had in 1992, a reflection on both Bush's incompetency and the skill with which President Obama infused humanity and warmth into an impressive technocratic command of the issues. Although I was very happy to lose my bet, I remained apprehensive about an Obama presidency for two reasons, both related to race and inequality and the looming threats to the Democratic Commons. First, because I knew my fair share of white, likely racist Republicans who had voted for Obama because they hoped that he would pursue a policy agenda that might change their material lives for the better, improve access to healthcare, restructure their neighbors' mortgages, shore up Social Security, and even strengthen their unions. I feared that an Obama presidency that propped up Wall Street while offering Main Street little in return would ultimately pave the way for a right-wing populist Republican presidential candidate in 2012 or 2016. Second, I was alarmed by the implications of President Obama's post-racial political pitch and persona. Specifically, the centrality of underclass metaphors to President Obama's so-called post-racialism made clear that Obama's understanding of racial inequality fit squarely within the parameters of a post-war liberal discourse on Black poverty and inequality that emphasized the role of race at the expense of political economy. To be sure, Obama frequently acknowledged racism's historic legacy via passing nods to matters such as FHA mortgage discrimination. However, his great speeches on race focused largely on poor Blacks' alleged cultural deficiencies and the need for African Americans to take personal responsibilities for their so-called own communities. The nation's first Black neoliberal president, post-racialism, thus shifted the blame for contemporary inequalities away from both racism and the damage inflicted disproportionately on Blacks by deindustrialization and neoliberal welfare, labor, and trade policies toward the character traits of the Black and brown poor themselves. The election of the nation's first Black president made clear the demographic trends, along with cultural shifts owed in part to the legislative victories of the civil rights movement, made it possible for a Black man to win the White House. Of course, the exuberant rhetoric surrounding Obama's historic racial first, which allegedly demonstrated the declining significance of racism, as well as the personal triumph of a Black man who, according to the hype, personified the struggles of Black Americans, obscured President Obama's commitment to neoliberal orthodoxies that had failed both Black and white, poor and working class Americans for a couple of decades. In 2016, race would become the principal lens through which many liberals would view the election of President Donald Trump. Specifically, the DNC, the corporate media, and many left identitarians took President Trump's surprise win over Secretary Hillary Clinton as evidence of working class whites' pathological commitment to white skin privilege, despite the fact that Trump's surprise victory over Secretary Clinton was owed to a combination of depressed Democratic turnout and to the celebrity game show hosts having flipped a substantial number of white voters who had voted for the nation's first Black president once or even twice before. Liberal commentators, many of them have insisted that the Trump victory made plain the futility of class-based political coalitions, as working class and middle class whites rejected Barack Obama's and Hillary Clinton's alleged progressive economic agenda in favor of Trump's hateful politics of resentment. This perspective, of course, imputed an economic progressivism that was absent from the Clintons and President Obama's brand of democratic politics. Indeed, no trade unionist would perceive the NAFTA, the TPP, or the means-tested Heritage Foundation-inspired ACA as evidence of a worker-friendly agenda. To be sure, these policies were less transparently harmful to working class people than President Jimmy Carter's and Federal Reserve Chair Paul Volcker's efforts to curb inflation by, to paraphrase Chairman Volcker, reducing the living standards of the average American. Still, it is no coincidence that the Carter, Clinton, and Obama administrations pursued policy agendas that undercut the livelihoods of a broad stratum of working people and were then voted out or succeeded by right-wing populists. This is not to deny the role played by social or cultural resentments, including racism, sexism, xenophobia, or homophobia, in the rise of Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and Donald J. Trump. Indeed, as I indicated previously, I feared that a centrist Democratic Obama presidency might be America's Weimar Republic, partly because of the racial resentments I knew all too well. I did lose a bet, right? Still, To acknowledge the important influence of race in American political and social life is not to insist that it operates independently of the world of human affairs. While many self-identified liberals and even a stratum of leftists have come to embrace metaphors like racism is our nation's original sin or racism is in our DNA, these constructs allow one to sidestep the proximate material cultural issues that inform racial ideology. If race is a social construct, racists are not born, as implied by the original sin and DNA metaphors. They are nurtured. Conservatives in both the old Democratic Party and the new Republican Party have long ginned up racial resentment for political gain. Likewise, prior to the enactment of anti-discrimination laws, employers and real estate investors alike fostered resentment toward racial and ethnic groups via racially tiered labor and housing markets, which explicitly pitted racial and ethnic group members against each other. Today, putatively liberal constructs such as structural racism, along with dominant understandings of diversity and even intersectionality, presume the existence of discrete racial group interests owed to shared group identity. While diversity and inclusion are often the formal aims of these constructs, since 2016, they've been deployed against egalitarian political projects that would benefit poor and working class, disproportionately Black and brown, but not exclusively, Americans. We saw Hillary Clinton, for example, use the language of structural racism and implicit bias to attack Senator Sanders' calls for banking regulation and tuition-free higher education, while deflecting attention from her complicity in tough on crime policy, super predators, and her husband's contribution to the subprime mortgage crisis, which did indeed impact Blacks disproportionately, but again, not exclusively. Following the brutal murder of George Floyd by Officer Derek Chauvin in May of 2020, we witnessed multinational corporations embrace intersectionality and structural racism as frameworks that provided corporate executives with a way to treat racial disparities as if they were owed to primordial or epigenetic identities or attachments, instead of capitalist processes that impact Blacks disproportionately, but again, not exclusively. Corporate-friendly visions of social justice that insist that representation matters while identifying the racial wealth gap as the main barrier to progress in the United States, offer poor and working class Blacks little more than vicarious wins. And they don't do much for anybody else either. Indeed, the class character of a racial justice discourse centered on the racial wealth gap is transparent if one considers two really important matters. First, 78% of the racial wealth gap is between the richest 10% of whites and the richest 10% of Blacks. Second, the top 50% of white wage earners possess 97% of all white wealth. Predictably, the centrality of the racial wealth gap to the dominant reparations discourse has led some policymakers and corporations alike to propose policies or programs that seek to foster wealth parity by promoting Black entrepreneurship, encouraging homeownership, and of course, diversifying the ranks of corporate and government leaders. Instead of much needed structural change, the current racial justice discourse lends itself to fairly modest reforms to a system that is less and less capable of distributing its rewards to a growing swath of working people across racial lines. Real wages have been on a 50-year downward slide thanks to automation, deindustrialization, the decline of the union movement, public sector retrenchment, and a depressed minimum wage. At the same time, urban regimes' commitment to growth politics, informed by unfettered corporate mobility, has led municipalities to shift tax burdens from businesses to workers, encouraging cities across the nation to subsidize development projects intended to court upscale residents. And that's my timer, so I have like 30 seconds left to say, so if you'll indulge me, to court upscale residents who can afford the taxes necessary to support urban infrastructures, AKA gentrification. These and other trends in late capitalism have impacted Blacks disproportionately, but again, not exclusively. If we don't want to simply grow the ranks of Black millionaires and billionaires, but instead we want to eliminate Black poverty while ensuring that Black children and adults have access to quality education, quality housing, well-paying jobs, and healthcare, then we need to insist on viewing racial inequalities through the lens of American capitalism. Doing so is not only the first step in improving the lives of the masses of Black Americans, but it may also help promote the kind of cross-racial solidarity that will be necessary to prevent an even more frightening expression of the sensibilities that gave us Ronald Reagan, Bush II, and of course, Donald Trump. And I'm done.
Thank you so much. That was very, very interesting. Lovely to hear you. We'll move on. I wanted to make one comment. If audience members have any questions for any of the speakers, you can put them in the Q&A at any time. So I just wanted to make a reminder, and we are going to have time at the end. We'll stop around 2:30 or 2:35 to take questions from the audience. So please feel free to do that. Let's move on to our final speaker this afternoon, Dr. Wendy Brown, who is class of 1936 first chair at the University of California, Berkeley, where she teaches political theory. She's best known for her interrogation of identity politics and state power in her book, States of Injury, Power and Freedom in Late Modernity, her critical analysis of tolerance in Regulating Aversion, Tolerance in the Age of Identity and Empire, for her account of the interregnum between nation states and globalization in Walled States, Warring Sovereignty, and for her study of neoliberalism's assault on democratic principles, institutions, and citizenship in Undoing the Demos, Neoliberalism's Stealth Revolution, and in 2019's In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, The Rise of Anti-Democratic Politics in the West. Her work has been translated into more than 20 languages, and she has held Guggenheim, ACLS, and Institute for Advanced Study fellowships. The last line of the bio she sent has particular meaning for us at Hunter and at CUNY, so I won't admit it today. She concludes by saying that she credits her thinking life to the excellent and accessible public universities of her youth and has worked in recent years to prevent their extinction. So please, we're happy to welcome you, Dr. Brown.
Thank you, Sam. And thank you, Ture and Ranjana and Dwight and Laz for extraordinarily provocative comments. I'm aware, as I offer my own, that the Democratic Commons among us has no common vocabulary or parlance, which rather than feeling as a source of frustration, I think we might feel as a source of excitement, because it seems to me that the great diversity and even disparity in our understanding of what we're talking about today suggests that we're inventing something. And that's how I understand the Democratic Commons, or the vocabulary that has come to operate in and around the Democratic Commons, is that it's an effort at bringing into being a vision for the future that entails a radical transformation of political economy, political life, and also the myriad sites of subjugation and injustice, racial stratifications, colonialism, gender subjection, and so forth. And that the Democratic Commons is trying to bring something into being for the 21st century that varies from that history while growing out of that history. So I take it, my own understanding of it, and this may not be what the organizers had in mind, is that it's an aspiration or a vision for a different order. And in this regard, I think my comments follow most closely on some of Ranjana's histories and concerns. So the very notion of the Democratic Commons for me represents a set of tensions, even paradoxes. Why? Because democracy, and not only liberal democracy, entails at the very least the following: political equality, that is genuinely equal voice and weight in decisions that affect us in common; pluralism, deep respect for difference; protection of minorities and individuals against majorities and the whole. But above all, democracy entails the really deliberate equal distribution of political power to each, as opposed to political power being concentrated in the few or left to markets, technocracies, institutions, and so forth. Democracy really promises, at its heart, democracy promises each an equal share in the political powers that we must control together or be controlled by. It's a distinctive form for ruling ourselves without surrendering our separateness. It requires, in that regard, disseminating political power widely so that we can collectively control our common lives in common. Now, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for me, remains the master theorist of this. He identifies what I've just depicted very briefly as the problem, to which, as he puts it, the social contract is the solution. I think he got much of the problem right, but there are very few fans of his solution. Another theorist who grasped the importance of achieving and maintaining the dispersion of power that democracy requires was Tocqueville, and I'll be drawing a little bit on him in the few minutes ahead. My general point so far, though, is that far from an easy or natural political form, democracy is probably among the most deliberately constructed and difficult. It requires enormous cultural and social support of the kind, for example, that Dwight was indexing as absent today, in the form of not only equal access to education, but equal access to knowledge and media in common. It requires constant vigilance against potential corruptions or degradations. And above all, it requires moving against what Tocqueville identified as the natural course of political power, which is to concentrate rather than disperse. Democracy, I would also identify with and as a distinctly human thing. It features all the complexity of our species. It doesn't make us better than the other species. It means that we have different dimensions, different aspects than some other species. It features the complexity, for example, of generating powers that we cannot control easily, but must control if we are not to be controlled by them. It centers on the problem of distributing and sharing power and the problems of deliberating and judging together across differences. Now, if that in a pithy version is something of what we need to understand democracy to be, the idea of the commons, on the other hand, I think identifies what we believe we share or rely on and must preserve together in order to meet human and planetary needs. In other words, the commons, and our woeful absence of a commons today indexes how badly we need a commons. A commons includes all that is essential to our common well-being: social, economic, ecological, cultural, and all that supports planetary life, not just that of Homo sapiens. Etymologically and historically, the commons signifies what is not royal or elite. It embraces and affirms the commoner. It signifies what is not private or privatizable. It embraces that which is ecologically and organically connected. It signifies that which is not divisible or partitionable, as opposed to what is public and unowned. It signifies what is not familial or individual, but rather social and shared. And it signifies what is not organized by formal legalism, but rather by mutual trust and mores. Now, we could go further here to say that the commons identifies what must remain unpartitioned, undifferentiated, undivided, unsubjected to sovereign whim, while democracy burdens us with the task of dividing and distributing power, attending to difference, marking out the provisional we, a bounded we, that is able to rule itself in common. So I'm suggesting that democracy worth the name is bounded and binding and sovereign in ways that the commons are not. And this means that democratizing the commons, or commoning democracy, as some refer to it, is very difficult, if not oxymoronic, or at least tension-ridden, operating on different planes. Democracy and the commons I've been suggesting so far are not exactly opposites, but they're hardly words for the same thing, and they hardly fit together with ease. So the aim might be, if a democratic commons or democratizing the commons is part of one vision, aspirational future, The aim might be to try to plumb and openly handle the tension between the commons and the needs or requisites of democracy, rather than try to simply resolve or overleap that tension. If, for example, the commons identifies concern with provisioning now and in the future, the well-being both of human beings and the planet, democracy is concerned with something else, not sharing existential elements of existence, but sharing humanly generated powers. And in its details, democracy is at least as complex and challenging as maintaining and sustaining the commons against privatization and pillage. There is, for example, with democracy today, the enormous problem of scale. In a world of globalized powers and production and global ecological threats and limits, what do we do with democracy, which requires something other than a global scale, which is simply unintelligible at a global level? There is the challenge of deep religious, cultural, and not only political differences and clashes. Reckoning with those means jettisoning universal justice claims in favor of unceasing cultural deliberation or cross-cultural deliberation and efforts at understanding. There's the challenge of educating for democracy and communication media for democracy, that challenge that Dwight dedicated his entire talk to. There's within this the challenge of somehow trying to imagine how not put that we put the genie back in the bottle of social media and the breakdown of education and knowledge in common and accountable to truth, but somehow reckoning with our current condition to provide accurate, accountable knowledge and analysis for all. There's the problem of keeping concentrated and private interests from corrupting democracy and keeping democracy oriented toward the public good. There's also what democracies don't do well. They don't respond very well to problems that are urgent or complex, what we might call a politics of emergency, which of course is the politics that most of us feel prevails in most quarters today. There's much more, but my point is simply this: the ideal of commoning provisions and protections doesn't relieve democracy of its challenges and difficulties in the 21st century. And it doesn't redress that old bugbear for socialism, which Michel Foucault depicted as the problem that socialism has no governing rationality of its own. We might put differently as socialism never having reckoned with the complexities and demands of political power, of democratizing political power, with the result that almost all 20th century socialist and communist regimes ended up autocratic, bureaucratic, despotic, or worse. In sum, what I'm trying to suggest is that democracy and the commons emerge from and identify two rather different problematics of human existence together, equally important. My point is not to reify a division between the political, democracy, and the economic, the commons, but rather to appreciate the careful work we have to engage in of relating them and distinguishing their needs and demands. And my other point is that ignoring this challenge was catastrophic for emancipatory visions and experiments in the previous century. And I think it's important that we not repeat this mistake as we develop visions for this century that are sustainable and just and democratic and inclusive.
It was great. Thank you so much. Very, very interesting. I think maybe, so we have around 45 minutes, and I would like to open the floor to questions in a few minutes. But before that, I don't know if any of the panel members have any comments they'd like to make, or any responses, or any things that struck you in listening to your fellow panelists. maybe you weren't expecting this. Sorry, I wasn't sure just if in hearing. Yeah, go ahead, Rajana. Yeah, please.
Thanks, everyone. I really enjoyed listening to everyone. Just as a term to maybe sort of bring up on the table, and I'm sort of thinking about this in relation to Dwight's talk. Actually, you know, that there's a Edward Said talks about the university. You know, he criticizes, of course, the U.S. politics in very many ways, but he talks about the university as a utopian form, and I suppose I'm interested in that idea, first of all, but also, you know, where utopia is as a genre of writing, as an aspiration in what we're talking about today. You know, why democratic commons rather than utopia is one way of posing that. So it's a big question. It's just, you know, where is the utopian language here today? Is it something that we're done with at this point? So I'm just throwing that out there.
It's a very provocative and fascinating question. This whole conversation is fascinating. So many new thoughts. But Ranjana, I think it goes back to something you began your talk with when you were talking about, you know, a lot of this has sort of been presupposed around a U.S. context. And so for me, I know it definitely struck a nerve with me, because that's certainly where I start, the point of departure for me as I started to think about this topic. And so one of the things that I struggle with around the question of the utopia rather than a kind of commons is that I begin from and I insist on almost the realization that American democracy never had a utopic moment, right? Because it was born out of this history of white supremacy at its core, right? So when you start to really think about what citizenship participation at its most literal level has meant to Black Americans, for example, I keep coming back to the fact that the practice of Black citizenship has always been mitigated by white supremacy. And so the idea that somehow there was a moment, or even the perfectibility question gets at least troubled by that for me. And then you add any number of other racial and gendered histories, et cetera, in this context. And you could, I'm sure, do the same. Again, I'm thinking about this specifically with any number of other contexts where you're thinking about democracies, right, globally. So I've always had a hard time thinking about it in forms that meet up with at least my measure for what I think qualifies as, you know, as a utopia.
And it raises an interesting point, if I may, about the question of consensus without transposition. So much the same way that in translation, you have to transpose certain signifiers to make them readily understandable or available in not quite its original form, but in a version that approximates others' experience of that which one is trying to translate. It becomes difficult then to achieve some consensus about what we might mean by a utopian project, what we might mean by a commons that's inflected with a sense of both the here and now and our connectedness to history. So the question of transposition is really key, and something that I really struggle with, and why so many of you have been so helpful to my thinking in your written work, and certainly today as well. It is, how do we ensure that, for example, in the context of populations that I study, Latinos, over 60 million, the largest majority minority in the country, how do you invest a community to achieve a sense of consensus about their belonging or their situatedness in history, when that history is not part of the local vernacular that they might understand, or one that they might even want to insert themselves into. So thinking of the question of consensus, it becomes crucial then to, and I think Dwight touched on this, the question of what we might call education as a practice of freedom and its role in American democratic practices. So rather than think of the commons as necessarily a thing, we can think of it as a series of practices that bring us closer to perfectible forms of coexistence that may not be necessarily utopic, but are a point of departure for understanding a commonality that would allow us to respect the needs of others. And this is something that I really struggle with. How do we inculcate in students a way to understand theoretical conceptions of commoning and understanding democratic practice when common elocution is impossible given the limited experience with the historical, that is their connectedness to history, the way that they might see themselves reflected in the curriculum, and the assumption that then education should not be normalizing. And this always reminds me of the great task of education from Dewey, from John Dewey onward, which is fundamentally, do we want an educational system in the United States that inculcates in citizens or citizens in the making a version of histories that replicate old world values? Or do we insist that we build new knowledge that is autochthonous to the degree that it can be, and that's connectedness to the past, but turns that past to different purposes, lest we replicate the monarchical structures, for example, that were part and parcel of how we understand education, say, in the older UK or what have you. So the challenge, and I need your help thinking through this, is how to make students, myself included, as participants in a project that could conceive of consensus across difference in a way that might perhaps entail transposition or some other metaphor that might be useful in understanding that connectedness to a utopic project that is something unimaginable to so much of our population.
I would just add that I think the question might be usefully relocated from one of utopia to one of visions for the coming decades. And the reason is that I think that we're all aware that one of the things that went into crisis with kind of end of, let's just put it this way, systematic analysis in which the critique was presumed to entail the solution, the kind of conceit that comes out of both the Kantian and Hegelian traditions, and certainly the Marxist tradition, and instead move to an understanding of history as producing certain openings and certain forms of reason and certain crises, which had to be developed, actively developed by human beings and social movements and political organization and so forth. And with that crisis of the old model, it seems to me there has also been a crisis in faith about developing and forecasting viable political, economic, social, and cultural visions of who we could be. There are exceptions to this. I mean, earlier someone mentioned the work of Jed Purdy. There have been others who have, really tried to give us a sense of what could emerge, what could grow out of our current conditions that was more emancipatory, more just, more sustainable, more viable for both the planet and the human species than what we have now. but those are rare. And I would not put Purdy in the utopian tradition. I would put him in the tradition of trying to develop a vision that is compelling, that to some degree addresses what Laz is talking about, which is people who are not necessarily oriented to or by a radical critical understanding of themselves, but might have some discontent about the way life is organized now, about existential dangers, ranging from climate crisis to biodiversity crises to crises of democracy. And it seems to me what the left is missing, both theoretically and politically, is the hard work of really thinking through what makes democracy work, what would make the commons work, what would make democratic socialism work, how would we be sure this time that it didn't have those despotic elements, those racist elements, those exclusionary elements, those north-south domination imperial elements. How would we be sure this time that we have visions that have that learning in them and that are also compelling, really compelling, that don't just address where people are, but address certain desires and frustrations and rancor and resentment and hopes and despairs that pull back from that brink and re-educate those feelings toward a different vision. And I just think the left has been woeful in that respect. There have been efforts, but I don't think they've been particularly strong. And I do think it has to do with a sense of not knowing where to go after we gave up on the idea that the critique entails the solution.
Maybe what we could do now, because I'm sorry, I as the moderator, my attention has been split this entire time between listening to everyone and then trying to keep track of other things as well. And so I'm looking at the question box, and there's a ton of if there's maybe we could pass to see, because I know it looks like a number of students and colleagues have written in, and if it's okay with everybody, I'll proceed there. Yeah, so the first question is from Devashish Basne. I hope I'm pronouncing your name. I kind of Frenchified it, sorry. But for Professor Khanna or for any of the panelists, when applying a post-colonial framework to the democratic commons, how do we contend with the quote unquote illegitimate democracy, as Jay Sakai argues? If the legitimacy of settler colonial institutions depends on colonial legacies of genocide and slavery to build the commons, again in quotes, how can we make sense of these contradictory truths?
I mean, I could have a stab at this, but
yeah.
I welcome anyone else on the panel to jump in and help out here. I mean, I suppose one thing that occurs to me, if we are going to think about the democratic commons in if we are going to stick to those terms, and if we are going to within those terms create some kind of sense of aspiration, as people have said, of some kind of hopefulness. I mean, it would. I think it will always have to be something that is that is both a movement forward and a movement backward at the same time. I mean, I think maybe this is what Laz was talking about in relation to translation. There's always going to be an inadequacy in the terms of the commons and of democracy as soon as we think beyond one language, right? And it is, and because those languages carry histories with them, and within within those inadequacies, there would have to be a kind of, you know, ruthless criticism of absolutely everything. I mean, you know, to put it in those kinds of Marxist terms, in order to maintain some kind of sense of an idea of futurity that hasn't already arrived, as it were, that is always going to be moved forward in an effort. Now, I mean, I think to my mind also, and this is partly why I sort of started my comments in the way that I did, there cannot be any kind of possibility of a democratic commons unless it's internationalist, right? I mean, to me, that's sort of a given, because I mean, otherwise, as we know, we just outsource problems, etc., to elsewhere, and then that elsewhere just keeps going on. And, you know, because I run the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute, I have to also say that you know, I mean, in his spirit, the very possibility that anything is understood as a local problem or a domestic problem is just misguided. It always has to be understood in terms of its global background, its global its global history, and its local instantiation. So, I mean, I suppose, you know, I feel as if I'm not really responding adequately to the question, but my response comes with the if we're going to stick to these terms, however what would one say, however problematic is such a, you know, a vague and meaningless term almost, but however problematic they are, it's in a sense always pushing forward with the knowledge of that history in order to say, well, you know, how is this, for example, romanticization of the idea of the commons, right, from before? How is it that certain genres of writing are, you know, I'm a literary person, so I have to say this, how certain genres of writing are falling into certain kinds of modes. You know, what does it mean that Thomas More in his Utopia talked about the commons, right? And how do we think about the structure of the utopian? What does it mean that some of the texts that Laz and Wendy have brought up as offering some kind of way forward are, you know, somewhat apocalyptic in their structure. So say, you know, Jed Purdy's, for example. I mean, and much of the Anthropocene literature. You know, I mean, these are interesting questions about the heritage of the genres in which we formulate our ideas of crisis and solution. And to me, you know, in a sense, the gift of the humanities is that we have the ability to make those demands on any kind of formulation that we have to offer, because we have to be conscious of their historical, geographical formations. So this is all very sort of vague, but I think that's all I can offer in response to that at the moment.
I'd like to jump in too then a little bit on this, Ranjana, and this is in some ways to go back to something Wendy said during her talk. There is a lot of disparity, right, between, I think, how we're all thinking about and through this idea of the democratic commons. And I, like Wendy, find that generative and fascinating. And but I want to just try and, because I think the question really gets at some of that too. So I want to provoke all of us a little bit and my own thinking as I think through this. I've been recently a part of some conversations with a small group of university presidents who are being organized by a foundation to think about the teaching of civics and civil education, but also civil society and how the role universities can and should be playing, if any, in the kind of, if you will, rebuilding of civil society. And so as I think about this issue on the ground of just literally the commons as a place, but to Laz's point, not just a destination or a place, but a place where we go to do things, where a set of practices are performed. I worry that the biggest difference that I'm troubling over, and I don't have an answer yet for this either, is the provocation that Toure began with, and that is that reifying of race undercuts the idea of the commons, right? So if we begin from that place, which is not altogether unlike the place I began from when I think sort of historically about in response to utopia, right? What I mean, I don't mean to sound, dramatic, but what hope is there, right? I mean, if we really, if we can't find a way, if identities are disqualifying and we somehow have to shed ourselves of those to enter the commons to do this thing that we do, I just, as a provocation, I just love to hear how we think about that and think through that as a problem.
I just want to add that I think this raises a question that comes up in the literature, if you will, on the Democratic Commons, which is why the Commons is being used today to substitute for public and publics. And I think in some ways Toure's concern, and the one that you supplemented here, Dwight, is much more easily responded to by thinking about publics and public, that there are certain things that are ineffably public, and that means they concern us all, but that doesn't mean they necessarily are commonly experienced or indivisible or shared in the same way. And there, I think it's easier to introduce the idea of differentiated histories, experiences of public life at the site of race and other subjugating powers. And I understand why certain people have wanted to push the commons forward in our discourse and push public out. They just think it's the opposite of private, and it's too thin, and it's too easily co-opted and so forth. But I'm not convinced. I'm just not convinced that giving up on the notion of what is public, and that is public responsibility, something that concerns us all, but above all is something unowned. That is the publica etymology, that it is unowned, and res publica, the republic, however badly enacted at the site of colonialism and genocides and exclusion of women and other things, res publica held out the idea that there were things that were public and shared by us and that must stay unowned. And the commons, I will now confess, worries me. It's not that, but partly in its vagueness and partly in its overzealousness. That was just to toss this back into the concerns that you and Toure and Ranjana in particular have raised about colonialism and the question of how to get there. Okay, enough.
Sorry about that. I was about to share that I think part of the problematic, as I'm seeing it, is this particular inheritance of liberal democratic thought, certainly in the US, has upended traditional notions of the state, so that right now culture substitutes for the work of the state. That is, we can assume that someone like Barack Obama, because he made it, that he espouses a particular type of political worldview and not a neoliberal one, as is the case, as the corporatist president that he was, who had an investment in privatization, economic efficiency, and individuals taking personal responsibility. So we're at this moment right now, as I see it, and from what I'm reading, and certainly what I've thought through on paper, is when culture substitutes for the practices of the state, how can we orient our national pedagogies, the stories that we tell about ourselves and our communities where we come from, our genesis story, if you will, that can somehow then be transposed or translated, if you will, into those who have never seen themselves outside the cultural sphere. That is, When we have over 24 pronouns that describe gender identity, but not one single critical analysis of why right now we're at a moment where trans communities are being limited access and their own personhood, then we need to think through our national pedagogies and how that idea that we inhere identities and we reify identities to such a degree that we foreclose the possibility for thinking through an analytics of distance that would allow us to both claim what we call in ethnic studies at least, a basic distinction between identity and identification. That is, identity is a state formation in a relationship to the state, because there are resources that inhere into, I don't know, being a university president and running a 501c3 organization where you're tax exempt. Well, what is the function of the public good within that context? So part of the challenge for me has always been how then to communicate to constituencies that have so rarefied and seen identity as the end all, and that representation is the end all, and move away from that into thinking through analytical practices that allow us to distance ourselves from ourselves long enough to see points of contact, bridges that connect us, but that somehow respect these individual identifications, but know the distinction between identification, whether identifies, I don't know, a goth, as I did when I was, in high school, as an immigrant who wanted to fit in, or as a Latino, and its relationship to the state. So these are some of the challenges that are really difficult, that entail reorienting what I've been here calling our national pedagogies, because we don't have a vocabulary for apprehending, that is grasping our hands around this idea of the commons when we've been so decentered by virtue of an insistence on having others reaffirm our identifications, as if these identifications carried the weight of state formative structures that give us access to, I don't know, clean water, redistribution of resources, or the purpose why we even have state identity documents. So these are some of the things that are really difficult for me to think through before we can get to a utopic vision of something outside the commons, like a public, for example, that Wendy mentioned.
Well, I'd like to make a very brief intervention. Well, those are famous last words because I'm terrible at brief interventions. But to connect some of the dots, or at least to give a shot at collecting some of the dots, it's striking that, and no coincidence, that the notion of the public we, as Laz put it at the start, has receded over the last few or more decades, as notions of identity have blossomed and culture, right? And this is one of the things that I was getting at, or the core issue of what I was getting at in my talk, not quite brief enough talk. But with as the notion of the public has receded, we have witnessed obviously a decline in the capacity of the faith that people have had, Americans have had, in the ability of government to improve their lives. And again, this leads to a kind of fractured understanding of who we are. It strikes me that if to connect this to the point that Wendy was making previously, that if we simply make the distinction between the public and private, as people used to do, and I was certainly raised to do for what it's worth, I think that can go a long way to improving our options, right? We all have a vested interest, or nearly all of us have a vested interest in clean air. We have a vested interest in clean, drinkable water. Most of us, if not all of us, have an interest in living in a society in which much of the populace is reasonably well educated. I think we all want to be well fed and to have shelter. We have a lot of things in common that we want from life and expect, that are all reasonable and appropriate. And it's, I think, should be pretty straightforward to lead, and keeping with Laz's point about how to connect with students on this, to stress to students and other Americans the things that we actually fundamentally have in common as organic beings, of course, which could take this to the global level, but I'm an Americanist, so I'm going to focus on the United States because that's just what I do. It should be easy to make these connections with people across, identity groups. And I think we often enough hobble ourselves in our capacity to make these important connections, because we don't devote enough attention to the distinction between the public and the private. These are the things that we as a public have in common. Our identities are actually quite private, I would submit. I mean, I don't think of race as an identity construct. I think that's actually kind of part of the problem. I think of race as an ascriptive category. There are multiple ways to identify as a white person or a Black person or a Hispanic person, et cetera, right? And that highlights, again, the fluidities that exist within the social constructs that are race. And what kind of unnerves me about identity-centered notions of race, as I alluded to, is this reification of race that you get when you imagine that there's such a thing as a singular Black interest or a singular white interest. And I think on some level, we all know that there can't really be a singular white interest. And all one has to do is think about, just to pick one example that I pointed to in my talk, that 43% of whites voted for President Obama in 2008, right? Obviously, the majority of whites didn't. I think 39% voted for him in 2012. But there's a fracture there among whites. Most people, I think, understand that there's a diversity of interest among whites. I think, oddly enough, people of color are often denied that complexity in our identity group discourse. And tends to be a presumption that there's some sort of singular Black interest. But again, I've rambled. The main point is that this notion of the public is crucial to making these connections across identity groups. And I think if we make the point about, if we stress the public, the things that we have in common, that doesn't obliterate the things that distinguish us. Certainly, there are many things that distinguish us, but it would allow many of us, the majority of us perhaps, to use state power to make for a more inclusive and fair and stable and just society in the United States and, of course, beyond.
Dwight, I don't know if you want to, we could, if you want to, yeah, go ahead.
Actually, there may be other questions. We could go at this for a long time, but yeah, why don't we just sit there? Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe
Can
we
I
can
just add, let me just add one more thing.
Go ahead, Wendy.
Please, no, actually, go ahead. Yeah.
I just want to say that my understanding of the commons as a term that has moved into left usage over, let's say, the last couple of decades, is that it's actually meant to substitute for and oppose the notion of statist public infrastructure and provisioning. And that it's actually a radical challenge to a certain kind of social democracy and bourgeois liberalism. So I want us to just, kind of bear that in mind as we talk about the public versus the commons, because I think those who are invested in the commons really don't want to go back to a language of the public, really don't want to go back to social states, but are really looking for a way to conceive of what they call inappropriable usage. The commons is what we can't take from, what we have together and can't be divided up and can't be, pillaged and exploited, but also isn't administered by the state. And it is supposed to have global reach in the theoretical literatures. That's how it's understood. But it's also supposed to be that which people govern themselves rather than something that is administered at the state level. So I'm just offer that distinction for those listening and for us to try to figure out, are we for that or against it? Or what do we think of that distinction? We don't have to go further in this conversation because I know there's 11 other questions that we want to answer. But I think that's what I took to be the provocation of this whole panel, is trying to think that way rather than in terms of public reinvestment, public provisioning, and so forth. Certainly the pandemic has given pause to those who opposed public investment, public provisioning, and public protections, because without states doing that kind of work, we'd be in even worse shape than we are now. But I don't think that has finished off the radical challenge to publics and the conception of the public versus the private that the commons was aiming to displace and displace.
I just want to say a word in response to what Tura is saying about, in some ways, identification, particularly how much of it, to my mind, is also driven by notions of experience, lived experience of trauma. So it's not just that the state imposes, or that even identities impose certain kinds of political actions on the part of one group or another, the Black vote or voting bloc as an example. But there is a material difference in how, when I am talking to a non-Black person about George Floyd, let's take as an example, and given my own lived experiences with police and state authority, it is not equal what we're bringing to that conversation, right? There is a different kind of emotional work that taxes me with that is different from my interlocutor. In the same way that if we were talking to someone experiencing slavery versus someone who was an abolitionist to slavery, which is part of what I try to think through in my earlier work, they are not the same things, right? And so, and that shows up in the language. And so a lot of the reason that you get Black voting blocs too has some to do with the fact that no matter, and I'll be crass for a moment, how much money I ever had in my life, like I could just, and even if there were things about fiscal conservatism that might benefit me over a blah, 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 I could never imagine myself voting against my own sort of social interest as I understand them via my lived experience. And that's one of the reasons that I think there's a difference between white people who could imagine themselves voting for Barack Obama in 2008 and who could imagine themselves, who voted for Donald Trump, 8 years later. I think one has to also just think through the lens, in addition to other things, the lens of that kind of lived experience that people bring to that kind of negotiation as well.
I think that's certainly true. People bring a lived experience. We all do, right, to the public sphere. But I would respectfully, I won't say disagree, but complicate this position that you staked out, Dwight, about, let's say, how you talk about George Floyd to a non-white person. I've certainly known, this is one of the nice things about teaching at a public university, I've certainly known a number of white people who've had run-ins with the law, and they're scared of police officers, right? I've certainly kept up with instances in which white people have been, or I should say non-Black people, but I think what we really mean is white people in this context, white people who have been beaten and shot and mortally wounded and outright killed by police officers. And a wonderful example of this horrible situation, or the horrible stretch of police violence, occurred a few years ago. Actually, it occurred right before the 2016 election with a police officer named Officer Feaster, it was his name, who had murdered a white man named Andrew Thomas. And he tracked down this guy. He followed a guy out of a bar, and high-speed chase. Long story short, the guy's ex-wife was thrown out of the car and killed at the scene. And as Andrew Thomas exited the vehicle, Officer Feaster calmly withdrew his handgun and shot this guy, paralyzing him, shot Andrew Thomas and paralyzing him. And ultimately, Mr. Thomas had succumbed to his injuries. I think he was a 26-year-old white man who had a number of run-ins with the law. The people of Paradise, California, which seemed to be a lower income white community, which I think was burned out of existence not too long afterward, were in the streets protesting and pointing out that their lives mattered, right? And they were expressing outrage over the fact that there was very little coverage of this incident. And my point is that people across racial lines actually have these kinds of experiences. And I suspect that you and I have both been profiled, let's say, as people of color. I'm often mistaken for Puerto Rican, but being from the Northeast Corridor, that's not a better deal. In my experience, that was worse. But I suspect that we've both been racially profiled by police officers and TSA employees in airports and wherever else. But it's that, and that experience shapes how we look at the world, to be sure. But there are white people who have comparable experiences, I would submit. And it's important to keep that in mind because that can be the basis for camaraderie and cooperation. And it also makes clear that we are all, the reason it can be the basis for camaraderie and cooperation is it makes clear that we are subject to the same forces, much the same forces. It might be a difference of degree, but much the same forces of police state action.
Yeah.
I hate to jump in like this, but it's time. It's 2:58. So this is unfortunately, I mean, we would love to have you guys here for a week and then we could really, do some work. But unfortunately, I thank you, Toure, for giving the last word today. And what I want to do, I would like to remind everyone, thank you to all the panelists for just really an excellent conversation. It was very just fascinating, really invigorating, and I know I learned a ton. So again, thank you, everyone. We would invite you all to please join us next Friday, April 16th, for the second roundtable in our series, which is Print, Podcast, Social, Public Humanities, and the Popular Media. And for now, I will throw it over to my great colleague, Jonathan Fenton, to send us off.
Well, thank you. Well, on behalf of Hunter President Jennifer Rabb and the directors of the Public Humanities Program, Professors Nico Israel and Linda Alcoff, I want to thank you, Sam, for doing an excellent job in moderating. And I want to thank the panelists for thoughtful, open, honest exploration of the complex tensions and paradoxes of the Democratic Commons, and also the search for what an aspirational Democratic Commons might look like. My successor at the New School, Dwight McBride, rightly reminded us of the central importance of universities in preparing a new generation to adapt the complex reality of our diverse nation to the founding principles and values of our nation. And we are grateful to the Mellon Foundation for enabling Hunter College, its faculty and students to engage the humanities in our quest for a more just, humane, and peaceful world. As president of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, I appointed a commission to study how to strengthen our democracy. It produced a compelling report, Our Common Purpose, with 30 concrete recommendations, which were based on a core observation, which I will quote: "A healthy constitutional democracy depends on a virtuous cycle in which responsive political institutions foster a healthy civic culture of participation and responsibility, while a healthy civic culture, a combination of values, norms, and narratives, keeps our political institutions responsive and inclusive." So with that, I just want to reaffirm the invitation to 2 future conferences that will continue our common journey. On April 16th, Print, Podcast, Social, Public Humanities, and Popular Media. And then on April 23rd, Reckoning with Monuments and Public Commemoration. We hope you will all join us, that you will bring your friends, colleagues, and students And we'll continue this really, really thoughtful and very, very complex and rigorous exploration. So I thank you all for coming.